John Bartlett was 42 years old when the weight of the world seemed to collapse on his shoulders in the most unceremonious of ways. For over 4 decades of his life, he had carried himself with unwavering discipline, rising at the same hour every morning, 5 o'clock sharp, before the sun had even thought of climbing into the sky. Day after day, he walked to the same train station, boarded the same cars filled with weary commuters, and looked out at the same blurred scenery of rain-streaked windows or snow-laden tracks. Whether the sky spat fire in the summer or cloaked the city in bitter ice in the winter, John's steps never faltered. His routine was not born out of compulsion, but out of a deep sense of honor, of responsibility, of the belief that when one gives a promise, it must be kept until the very end. He never missed a day. He never asked for more than what was given. He never once allowed himself the luxury of saying, "I cannot today." And yet, when the day of his retirement finally came, a day that should have been crowned with gratitude, affection, and dignity, the company he had helped to build reduced his 42 years of sacrifice into the barest shell of acknowledgement. No heartfelt words, no speech of thanks, not even a gesture to suggest that he had mattered. They placed him at a plastic table, on a chair that creaked beneath him, with nothing more than a dry hamburger and a cheaply printed photograph bearing his tired face. A small plaque lay beside it, with letters that read "Happy Retirement," cold, impersonal, stripped of all human warmth. That was all. That was the ending of a man's loyalty, a man who had kept his back straight and his hands calloused for almost half a century. He had given them his life's mornings, his strength, his very bones, and this was the echo he was left with. How could a life of such relentless devotion be closed with so little grace, so little humanity? Perhaps the answer lies in the blindness of those who benefit most. Sometimes, those who sit in higher offices forget that behind the machines and the numbers, behind the endless reports and projects, there are souls who rise before dawn and return home when the stars are already stretched across the sky. John was one of those souls, invisible in plain sight, a man who taught new workers when they stumbled, who shared his knowledge of every crevice and corner of the factory floor, who carried not only the weight of his labor but also the warmth of kindness that kept others standing on days when they themselves wanted to give up. Yet, for the executives, he was reduced to a statistic, a line on a payroll, a shadow that clocked in and clocked out. To them, his retirement was not an occasion for gratitude but an inconvenience to be rushed, a box to be checked off. They failed to see the man. But God, and the world, did not fail. It was in that room, filled with plastic tables and half-hearted chatter, that another heart broke in silence. Maria, one of John's colleagues, could not bear to watch the scene unfold without trembling. Her throat burned with unshed tears as she looked at the man who had once helped her fix a machine on her first nervous day, who had stood by her when others mocked her inexperience, who had always greeted her with words that lifted the fog of fatigue. She watched him sit there, holding that plaque with a faint, bewildered smile, his tired hands tracing its edges as if trying to make sense of what 42 years had been reduced to. And Maria did what perhaps God had placed her there to do. She took out her phone, pressed record, and captured the moment that would echo across the globe. She posted it online, adding words heavy with truth. This is not how it should end. Not like this. Not for him. Why did her hands tremble as she typed those words, and why did the world suddenly feel the sting of injustice in their own hearts? The reason is simple, and yet profound, because John was not merely John. To millions of strangers who saw the video, he became their father, their grandfather, their neighbor who worked quietly at the corner shop, the bus driver who greeted them every morning, the janitor who kept the hallways clean while children rushed past without saying thank you. John became a mirror of all the unsung heroes who carried the weight of families, communities, and companies, yet received nothing but silence in return. When the video spread, tears streamed down faces of people who had never heard his name before, because they recognized him. They recognized the sacrifice. They recognized the dignity. And in their hearts, they whispered, "That could be my father. That could be me." The power of Maria's recording was not in its quality, not in the angles or the sound, but in its truth. It stripped the mask from a world too often obsessed with celebrating the wrong things, wealth without kindness, power without compassion, success without loyalty. It showed a man who had never demanded the spotlight, suddenly thrust into it not by his own choice but by the injustice he endured. And yet, Within that injustice, something miraculous began to stir. Outrage turned into empathy. Empathy turned into action. The world was reminded that gratitude is not meant to be silent, that honor is not meant to be hidden, that a life like John Bartlett's must not end in the shadows of indifference. Could the silent goodness of one man truly move the hearts of millions? And if so, what does that say about the world we live in? The answer, resounding and unshakable, is yes. For when people watched John sitting quietly with his plaque, his weary smile betraying none of the storms inside, they were reminded of their own struggles, of their own sacrifices gone unnoticed. And suddenly, John was no longer alone. Across continents and time zones, strangers united in a wave of compassion, declaring in one collective voice, "You matter. Your work mattered. Your life mattered." It was as if heaven itself whispered through them, reminding John, and reminding us all, that though human gratitude may falter, divine remembrance never fades. Thus began the miracle. His co-workers, ashamed of what the company had failed to do, opened a fundraising account online, hoping to give John the farewell he deserved. They expected a few donations, perhaps enough to offer him a small vacation or a modest celebration. But what came was beyond their imagination. People from every corner of the world began to give not because they knew John personally, but because they knew what he represented. $5 here, 10 there, sometimes 50, sometimes even 500. It didn't matter the amount. What mattered was the love, the solidarity, the unspoken acknowledgement that when the world is unjust, people can rise together to correct it. And in just a few days, the number soared into the hundreds of thousands. John Bartlett, who once thought his story had ended with a plastic chair and a dry hamburger, was now living proof that kindness does not go unnoticed forever. The money that poured into that GoFundMe account was more than just numbers on a screen. It was proof that humanity, though often drowned out by greed and indifference, still carried a deep well of compassion. John, a man who had lived most of his life with his head bowed in humble silence, suddenly found himself lifted onto shoulders he never imagined could exist. News outlets began to cover his story, sharing his image across newspapers and television screens. Strangers sent messages filled with warmth, telling him that his perseverance had inspired them to keep going in their own battles. Parents showed the video to their children, explaining, "This is what loyalty looks like. This is what integrity means." And though John himself had never craved recognition, the glow of that moment seeped into the cracks of his weary heart like sunlight breaking through after a long winter. For the first time in decades, John was not invisible. For the first time, people looked at him not as just another worker whose name could be forgotten on a timesheet, but as a symbol of resilience, humility, and honor. And perhaps the greatest irony of all was this: the very company that had failed to recognize him became the stage for his recognition by the world. In trying to dismiss him quietly, they had inadvertently set the stage for his story to shine brighter than they ever intended. And the people, those who had never walked beside him in the snow or sat across from him on the morning train, understood something profound. John's worth was never in the plaque, nor the paycheck, nor the shallow farewell. His worth had always been in the quiet, daily sacrifices that no one applauded but everyone benefited from. How many of us, like John, go unseen in our daily struggles, giving everything we have without expecting thanks, and what would it mean if we too were suddenly recognized? The truth is staggering when you think of it. The world is built not by those who stand on podiums or sit in corner offices, but by men and women like John Bartlett, those who wake before dawn to provide, who endure weather and weariness without complaint, who keep machines running, classrooms open, streets clean, meals prepared. If the world could pause for a moment and see them, truly see them, perhaps gratitude would flow more freely. Perhaps bosses would shake hands more firmly, families would say thank you more often, and neighbors would look each other in the eye with recognition. John's story was not just a moment of justice for him, but a mirror that reflected back to society the faces of millions of unsung heroes who silently hold it together. And in that reflection, many hearts broke open. People confessed in comment sections and phone calls to loved ones that they had forgotten to thank their fathers for all the nights they worked double shifts, or their mothers for the endless sacrifices they made without complaint. Young workers shared that John's story gave them the strength not to quit when jobs felt thankless. Retirees said they wished someone had noticed their years of service too, and yet they smiled with tears in their eyes, knowing that at least John had been seen. The story was no longer about one man, it became a collective healing, a balm to countless wounds inflicted by indifference. And in that healing, there was also repentance, a quiet vow, whispered in millions of hearts, to never again take loyalty and sacrifice for granted. Why does it often take the pain of witnessing injustice to awaken gratitude in our own lives? Because gratitude, though powerful, is so easily swallowed by routine. We become accustomed to the steady hands that provide, to the clockwork sacrifices that appear each day, and we forget that behind them lies a soul who aches, who dreams, who longs to be acknowledged. It is only when silence turns into neglect so loud it cannot be ignored, like John's retirement, that the world jolts awake. And in that jolt, people begin to see not just him, but everyone around them through a different lens. Gratitude is born anew, not out of obligation, but out of recognition of humanity itself. Perhaps that is why John's story struck so deeply. It reminded us not to wait until it is too late to say thank you. For John, the awakening was just as profound. He had spent his life believing that to serve quietly was enough, that acknowledgement was not necessary. And while humility was his strength, even he could not deny the warmth that spread through him as letters and messages arrived from strangers, some telling him they prayed for him, others sending photographs of their own fathers and grandfathers, with captions like, "He reminds me of you." Suddenly, John saw his life not as a wasted offering to a company that turned its back on him, but as a testimony of perseverance that had rippled across the earth. His 42 years were no longer measured by the coldness of a plaque, but by the fire of millions of hearts awakened by his story. Could it be that what we consider the end of a chapter is, in truth, only the beginning of a much greater story? For John Bartlett, it was undeniably the beginning. The donations, which had now surpassed $120,000, were more than financial relief, they were a resurrection of dignity. He could breathe without the constant fear of running out of money before the end of the month. He could dream again, something he had long forgotten how to do. When asked by a journalist what he planned to do with the money, John did not speak of luxuries or revenge. Instead, he smiled softly and said, "I want to take my wife somewhere by the sea. She has stood by me all these years, and she deserves to rest too." His answer, humble and tender, only deepened the love the world felt for him. For even when given abundance, John's first thought was not himself, but those he loved. And so, the story began to transform from one of sorrow into one of hope. Churches spoke of him in sermons, teachers used him as an example in classrooms, and families gathered at dinner tables to discuss the meaning of his perseverance. John Bartlett had unknowingly become a symbol of what it meant to live a life of quiet greatness. His story taught that no act of loyalty is wasted, no sacrifice unseen, no kindness forgotten. For when men forget, heaven remembers, and when companies dismiss, the world itself may rise to honor what they ignored. John had lived 4 decades in the shadows, but now his life shone like a lantern in the night, guiding others to see, to feel, to remember. John could hardly believe what was happening. Each morning he awoke with the old instinct to dress quickly, lace his boots, and head for the train, but now, instead of rushing to the factory, he found himself reading messages from people across the globe. Some wrote in broken English, others in flowing letters, yet all carried the same message. "Thank you for your life, thank you for showing us what true strength looks like." Men told him he gave them courage to keep providing for their families even when jobs were harsh. Women told him he reminded them of their fathers who had passed away, leaving behind legacies carved not in monuments, but in sweat and sacrifice. Young workers said his story kept them from quitting, that they wanted to endure with his same quiet dignity. John, who had once thought his life unremarkable, now saw that he had unknowingly become a teacher to the world. But even as the love of strangers surrounded him, a deep ache remained in his chest, not bitterness, not anger, but a profound sense of longing. He wondered what it would have been like if, on that final day at the company, his boss had simply looked him in the eye and said, "John, thank you." Would the video have been needed? Would Maria's tears have spilled? Would the world have had to rise to give him what his own workplace had denied? He didn't know. Yet as he sat in the quiet of his home, plaque resting on the table, he realized something. Sometimes it is in the absence of human gratitude that divine gratitude shines brightest. Because while one company failed to honor him, the heavens themselves had orchestrated a chorus of recognition louder than he could have dreamed. Is it not true that sometimes the greatest blessings in our lives come disguised as disappointments, forcing us to see that what we lost was never meant to define us? Indeed, John's disappointment became the doorway to a revelation. What he thought was the end of his story was only the unveiling of its true meaning. If his boss had given him a proper farewell, it would have ended there, in a room of polite applause and empty words, remembered only by a handful of colleagues. But because there was no applause, the silence screamed across the world. Because there were no words, Maria's trembling voice found its way into millions of hearts. And because the farewell was so painfully empty, the response from humanity overflowed to fill the void. Sometimes, the failure of men becomes the canvas on which God paints his brightest masterpiece. And John Bartlett, a man who never once sought recognition, became a global reminder that heaven does not forget what earth overlooks. As donations continued to pour in, John found himself asking not what he could do for himself, but what he could do for others. He began to dream quietly of ways to use this unexpected blessing. He spoke to Maria about perhaps creating a small scholarship for young workers, so that those who came after him would have more choices than he did. He thought of supporting charities that helped struggling families, for he knew too well the pain of living paycheck to paycheck, never knowing if it would stretch far enough. Though his hands trembled when he thought of handling such a sum of money, more than he had ever held in his life, his heart beat with a simple truth: blessings are never meant to be hoarded. They are meant to be shared, to ripple outward just as his story had rippled outward into the world. Question: could it be that the reason John's story touched so many was because deep inside, people are hungry for lives that give, not just take? The answer reveals itself in the way people responded to him, not with envy, not with bitterness, but with joy. They rejoiced in his blessing because they saw that his entire life had been one long gift to others. He had given his youth, his health, his time, and his energy without ever asking for praise. And now, when fortune came to him, it felt like justice, like balance, like the earth itself was finally righting what had been tilted for too long. People rejoiced not because John had become rich, but because a man who had always given without receiving was finally being filled. They rejoiced because in honoring him, they were honoring every unseen sacrifice in their own families, every quiet act of love that had gone unnoticed. In John's gain, the world felt a collective healing. And John, for his part, embraced it with humility. He never spoke with resentment against his company, never cursed the name of his boss. When asked by reporters if he was angry, he simply shook his head and said softly, "I gave them my best. That's enough for me." Those words disarmed even the harshest critics, for they revealed a heart free of bitterness. He had every right to be furious, every reason to demand justice, yet he chose grace. And in choosing grace, he became even greater in the eyes of those who watched his story unfold. For nothing is more powerful than a man who, though wounded, refuses to wound in return. What does it say about true strength, that it is not found in demanding revenge, but in choosing forgiveness even when the world calls for anger? It says everything. True strength is not the ability to strike back, but the ability to remain steady, to keep one's soul untainted by the poison of resentment. John understood that bitterness would only chain him to the past, to the plastic chair and the dry hamburger. Forgiveness, however, lifted him above it, freeing him to walk into the future unburdened. And though the company never came forward with an apology, it no longer mattered. The apology had come in another form, through the tears of strangers, the prayers of millions, the love of people who would never meet him yet felt bound to him forever. That was apology enough. That was restoration enough. And so, John Bartlett began a new chapter, not as a forgotten retiree but as a living testament to endurance, humility, and divine justice. His days were now filled with visits from journalists, neighbors bringing food with shy smiles, children waving at him on the street as if he were a hero from their bedtime stories. Yet beneath it all, he remained the same John, quiet, gentle, rising early not out of duty anymore, but out of habit, walking to the train station not to work but to watch the sunrise, marveling at how life could still surprise him after so many years of sameness. And in those quiet dawns, he whispered a prayer of thanks, not for the money, not for the fame, but for the simple truth that his life, once overlooked, had finally been seen. As the weeks passed, John found that the miracle unfolding around him was not just about the money or the recognition, it was about a transformation of identity. For 42 years he had been the worker, the man with grease-stained hands and tired eyes who walked through the factory gates unnoticed. Now, suddenly, he was something else, a voice for the voiceless, a living reminder that sacrifice and perseverance carry a sacred weight. Invitations arrived from schools and community centers, asking him to speak to young people about endurance, humility, and the dignity of work. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking was never his way. He had always been more comfortable with action than with words. But then he thought of Maria, whose trembling voice had sparked the movement, and he realized that sometimes silence must give way to testimony. And so he stood before crowds, simple and unpolished, telling his story with the same quiet honesty with which he had lived his life. The audiences wept. Not because John's words were crafted with elegance, but because they were drenched in truth. He told them about the mornings when his bones ached but he rose anyway, about the snow that soaked his boots, about the times he wanted to quit but whispered to himself, "I can do this." He told them how the paycheck barely covered expenses, but how he still found joy in teaching new workers, encouraging them to believe they could endure too. And then, when he spoke of that final day, the plastic table, the dry hamburger, the hollow plaque, silence always filled the room, broken only by sniffles and the rustle of tissues. And yet, he never ended there. He always lifted his head and said, "But what my boss did not see, God saw. And what my company forgot, the world remembered." Why is it that stories told in raw honesty, without polish or pride, pierce deeper into the heart than the grand speeches of the powerful? It is because truth has a language of its own, one that does not need perfection to be heard. John's story was not wrapped in eloquence, but in authenticity, and authenticity is what the human heart craves most. People are weary of being told what success looks like by those who live far above them. They long instead to hear from someone who has walked the same cracked pavements, endured the same sleepless nights, and carried the same burdens. John's voice was the voice of every man and woman who had ever been overlooked, and that is why his words struck like lightning in every room he entered. His story reminded the world that greatness is not found in titles or riches, but in the simple courage to rise every morning and give your best, even when no one notices. John's own heart, too, was pierced by what he witnessed in those audiences. He saw fathers hold their sons a little tighter, young workers standing taller with newfound pride, elderly men wiping their eyes because they knew exactly what it meant to labor without applause. And as he watched, John began to understand that his suffering had never been wasted. Every step through the rain, every ache in his back, every ignored effort had become part of a story bigger than himself. What once felt like 42 years of obscurity was now 42 years of preparation, for this moment, for this testimony, for this awakening in the hearts of thousands. Could it be that the pain we endure in silence today is shaping us for a purpose we cannot yet see? Yes, and John's life was the living proof of it. For all those years, he thought his labor was only about survival, about putting food on the table and keeping the lights on. But now, looking back, he saw that each sacrifice was a seed planted in the soil of time. And when the day came that the world finally looked his way, those seeds burst into bloom, not just for him, but for everyone who saw themselves in his journey. His pain had not been meaningless. It had been preparing a harvest of hope that would spread far beyond the walls of his factory. John realized that sometimes God allows silence, not because he is absent, but because he is building a story so powerful that when it unfolds, it will bring light to multitudes. And yet, John remained grounded. Despite the attention, despite the donations, despite the articles and interviews, he still rose early each morning, still walked to the train station just to watch the sunrise. He carried with him the same lunchbox he had used for decades, not because he needed it anymore, but because it reminded him of who he was and who he would always be. Humility had been his companion for 42 years, and he refused to trade it now for pride. When asked if he felt like a hero, he only smiled and said, "No, I'm just a man who kept showing up." But those who heard him knew better. They knew he was not just a man, he was a living sermon. What is it about humility that makes a person shine brighter than any wealth or fame ever could? It is because humility is the fragrance of the soul. It does not demand attention, yet it commands respect. It does not shout, yet it is heard louder than thunder. John's humility made him unforgettable, because in a world obsessed with self-promotion, he was content to remain small. And yet, in remaining small, he became great. People trusted him because he did not seek to impress them. He simply offered himself as he was, ordinary, tired, flawed, but real. And realness, when combined with humility, becomes a beacon brighter than any spotlight. John Bartlett's greatness was not in what he gained, but in what he never lost, the ability to remain kind, grateful, and gentle, even when the world gave him every reason to harden his heart. The donations eventually stopped, the headlines moved on, and the viral videos were replaced by newer stories, as the internet always does. But what remained was something far greater than fleeting fame. What remained was a legacy. John Bartlett's name had become a symbol whispered in classrooms, remembered in churches, spoken at family dinners. He was no longer just a man who retired with a plastic chair and a dry hamburger. He was the man who reminded the world that unseen labor is not forgotten, that sacrifice has eternal value, that when men fail to honor, God himself stirs the hearts of millions to do what is right. And John, sitting quietly at his kitchen table, sipping his morning coffee, knew that his story was no longer his own. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt invisible, and it would keep breathing long after his own breath had ceased. In the quiet of his later days, John often sat by the window, watching the world go by with a gentleness that only comes from a life fully lived. He did not crave more. He did not envy those with larger houses or shinier cars. He had already received something that no wealth could buy, the knowledge that his life had mattered. His hands, though roughened by decades of labor, felt lighter now, as though the burdens they had carried had been lifted by the love of millions. And in the evenings, when the sun sank low and painted the sky in colors of fire and gold, John would whisper prayers of gratitude, not just for the blessings he had received, but for the trials too, for it was through those trials that the meaning of his life had been revealed. Sometimes he wondered why it had taken so long for his story to be seen. Why had 42 years passed in silence? Why had the recognition come only at the end? Yet whenever those questions stirred, he found peace in the thought that perhaps this was the only way it could have happened. For if he had been honored too soon, the world would not have heard. If his farewell had been filled with applause and praise, Maria would not have cried, the video would not have been filmed, and millions would not have been touched. It was the very absence of honor that made the honor so great. And in that paradox lay the quiet wisdom of God, that sometimes the lowest valleys prepare us for the highest mountains, and sometimes the silence of men prepares the stage for the voice of heaven to thunder. Is it not true that what feels like delay in our lives is often divine timing, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal its purpose? Yes, it is true, and John's life was the proof. Every step in the rain, every dawn on the train, every unnoticed act of kindness had been building toward that moment when the world would finally see what had always been there. His story became a reminder to never despise the quiet seasons, never assume that silence means insignificance. For though recognition may not come when we expect it, it comes when it is meant to, and when it does, it arrives not as a whisper but as a roar. John Bartlett, the man whose farewell was once marked by a plastic chair and a dry hamburger, had become the symbol of all who give their best without applause. And in honoring him, the world unknowingly honored every unseen hand that had ever carried it forward. And so his story closes not with bitterness, but with glory. Not with shame, but with dignity. Not with silence, but with a song sung across nations. John Bartlett's name lives now as a parable of perseverance, a testimony that no act of love, no hour of labor, no sacrifice of loyalty is ever truly forgotten. For when men fail to honor, God remembers. When companies forget, heaven takes note. And when the world seems blind, it only takes one trembling hand, like Maria's holding a phone, to open millions of eyes. John Bartlett's plaque may have been cold and hollow, but his legacy burns bright and eternal, carried in the hearts of strangers who will never forget the man who taught them that greatness is not in what you take, but in what you give.